When we concluded our class last week, we had seen the failure of Solomon. We'd seen the foolishness of Rehoboam. We'd seen how that the prophet Ahijah had appointed Jeroboam to become the first king of northern Israel. The nation now is divided into two nations, northern Israel, southern Judah. And we saw the great promises that God offered to Jeroboam if he would only follow his will. But Jeroboam, he was a failure. He changed nearly everything that God had instructed. He decided to do things his own way. That is so often characteristic of people. When they receive some blessing, why they take advantage of it rather than using it, they abuse it. But we have now Rehoboam on the south, Jeroboam on the north. But we're not through with Jeroboam. 1 Kings chapter 14 is where we begin tonight. And we read here of a son of Jeroboam named Abijah. Now you'll see the similarity between that name and that of the prophet that we studied about last week, Ahijah. Keep the men separate and apart. Abijah is probably the heir to the throne of Jeroboam, but he was sick. Jeroboam was anxious about it. He wanted to find out what would be the outcome for Abijah. He knew the prophet Ahijah would be able to tell him, but he didn't want to go to Ahijah. I don't know whether it was because he was embarrassed. I doubt that he was embarrassed. I doubt if he had enough sensitivity to be embarrassed about what he had done. But he didn't want to go to Ahijah to inquire, but he was going to send his wife. And not only that, he was going to send her in disguise, where Ahijah, he thought, would not find out who it was that was making inquiry. Well, as she made her way to the prophet Ahijah, God, and we're not told how, but God spoke to Ahijah and told him that she was coming and told him what to tell her when she got there. It's right humorous to me, just a little bit, that when she got there, Ahijah greeted her, "Come in, wife of Jeroboam." He blew her disguise right away. He knew what was going on. He said, "Come in. I've got bad news for you." And he did have a whole series of bad news for him. In verse 9, or verse 8, he told him, "Now, I took the king, the part of the tribes away from David. I gave it to you. But," verse 9, "you've done evil in the sight of God." And in verse 10, he said, "I'm going to bring evil to the house of Jeroboam." And in verse 11, look what a future for the house of Jeroboam. "Him that dieth of Jeroboam in the city shall the dogs eat. Him that dieth in the field shall the fowls of the air eat. For the Lord has spoken it." What a future to look forward to. In other words, none of the family of Jeroboam was even going to have a tomb. They would be devoured by the wild animals. And furthermore, when your feet enter back into the city, the child, referring to Abijah, he will die. And in verse 14, he said, God will raise up another king. He's going to cut off the house of Jeroboam. Well, sure enough, that's what happened when she got back. Why, she came to the threshold of the door, verse 17, the child died. Abijah was the only one of Jeroboam's family that had a funeral. All the rest of them were eaten up by wild beasts. People think sometimes they can outsmart God. I want to impress upon us this truth, dear friend, as we see these people. We're studying not just the history, but let's see these people and the lessons we can learn. God keeps his promises, doesn't he? God is faithful. God keeps his threats and warnings also. He had promised great things to Jeroboam. He blew it. And his warnings, you will be a disastrous situation, and your family shall be devoured. So, verse 20, Jeroboam died, and his son Nadab becomes his successor. Now, we'll read about Nadab becoming king in just a little bit, but we're going to have a little a little turn in the message here. Put a J over verse 21. As I mentioned to you, or suggested, you can do what you want to. I put an NI over some verses when you're going to talk about northern Israel. Put a J over some verses when you get ready to talk about Judah. I'd put a J right there. In fact, I've already put my J on verse 21. And we turn over here to Rehoboam and to southern Judah. Well, verse 22 tells us that Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord and provoked him to jealousy with their sins which they had committed above all that their fathers had done. Do you remember we mentioned last time how from the time that they divided, with few exceptions, both nations just went into decline. Now, occasionally they'd bump up a little bit, but they were mostly decline. Why? Because the next generation looks like was just worse than the one that they followed. And that's what happened here now in Judah. And to humble Rehoboam, verse 22 tells about Shishak, the king of Egypt. Shishak, the king of Egypt, comes up and invades southern Judah, and he takes all the treasures out of the house of Rehoboam and all of the shields that he had. And he just humbled Rehoboam to where Rehoboam, he wasn't much of anything. He didn't have any power. He didn't have any control. He didn't have any armament. He just humiliated himself in the things that he did. And I want you to notice verse 30, because this is a sad, sad verse. There was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all their days. What must God have thought? This was the nation that he chose. Here were God's people. You remember when Jeroboam broke off, Rehoboam wanted to go up and make them come back, but God told him, no, you don't fight. But they did fight. God looked upon this nation. It was divided. They was not only divided, they hated one another. They warred against one another the whole time of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. I think the condition of the people certainly must have grieved the heart of God. Don't you think so? And in verse 31 we read that Rehoboam died. It says he slept with his fathers. And Abijam, his son, reigned in his stead. Now look at this, Abijam. Look how close that is to Abijah. Now I told you when we started, we're going to see names that are so similar, if you don't get mixed up, you're not normal. You're just going to have to go over it and over it and over it. And to further complicate things, if you wanted to, we read of this in the Chronicles, and Abijam is named Abijah, the same as Jeroboam's son. But we're not going to go over there. We're going to stay over here. We're going to keep them separate as much as we can. Abijam is the son of Rehoboam, and Abijah, that died, was the son of Jeroboam. Now, Abijam is king. So if you look on your king chart, we've come down just a little bit from Rehoboam to Abijam. And what about Abijam? Well, verse 3 says in chapter 15, he walked in all the sins of his father. And verse 4 says, nevertheless, for David's sake did the Lord his God give him a lamp in Jerusalem. He didn't take the kingdom away from him completely, not because he was deserving, but because of the seed of David. Because David, verse 5 said, did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Well, you know that had to do with Bathsheba. Look at verse 6. It's a repeat of verse 30 back in the last chapter. There was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And verse 7, there was war between Abijam and Jeroboam. So Rehoboam and Jeroboam were always at war. Abijam and Jeroboam, they were always at war. It just looked like could not have peace between these two nations. And finally, verse 8, Abijam died. He slept with his fathers, and his son Asa is made king. Now look on your king chart, you see Asa. From Asa down to Jehoshaphat there on the left, that's a big space there, isn't it? That's a good many years. Asa is king, folks, over here in southern Judah, while over here in northern Israel, they're having a bunch of kings. Changing in dynasty, different families taking up the rule of the nation. And Asa, he's a breath of fresh air. All these kings so far, they just, I hate to use the word stink, but well, they smell bad. But Asa is different. How was it that Asa was different? We're not told exactly. But let me make this point. Somebody must have taught Asa the right way to go. Now, the nations were wicked. But isn't there the impression here that somebody in those nations, even so, was still trying to do what was right? They were still righteous people. Somebody taught Asa to be different from those that he had gone before, or that had gone before him. I make a point. Our nation, it's declined terribly in recent decades. Regardless of how wicked our nation might become, we can be the people that keep the truth alive just the same. Somebody has to. Brother Ben.
In verse 10, 15, it mentions his mother, Maacah.
Yes.
She's been the one that taught little Asa.
Do what?
There's some reason she is mentioned there, and maybe she's the one that taught him in that context.
Maybe so, but you go down just a little bit further, we see that this woman had an idol in a grove, and Asa, he made some reforms. Look what he did. He did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did David his father, verse 11. He took away the Sodomites out of the land. He removed all the idols that his father made. He even took the idol that Micaiah, his mother, had, the queen mother, and he even destroyed that. Even her influence in idolatry, he didn't put personality before God. He didn't put kinfolks before God. Asa was a good man. Now, he wasn't perfect. He's going to blunder here in a little bit, but he was a good king. The few good kings that Judah had, it is generally figured that Judah had maybe 6, possibly 8 kings that were commendable, but northern Israel didn't have a single solitary one. Here's where Asa blundered. Verse 14. We can learn from this, folks. But the high places were not removed. Nevertheless, Asa's heart was perfect with the Lord all his days. The high places, what were they? They were the places where those who were idol worshipers built their altars. They would go and make their little church. That's where they would make their sacrifices. Now, he did good to destroy the idols. He did good to destroy the immorality of the nation. But he left the seeds there that they could pick it up anytime they decided to go back to idolatry. They still had their high places.
He didn't hardly go far enough, did he?
I'm sorry, you'll have to speak up because I'm deaf as a post and can't hear either.
He didn't hardly go far enough.
He was going in the right direction. If he had only destroyed those places, they wouldn't have had a place to start up again. That's one blunder that this good man makes. He's not perfect, as I said, but he didn't make enough. Now look at verse 16. There was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. Now we hadn't gotten to Baasha to be king yet. We're going to get how he becomes king in just a few minutes. But if you look over here on your chart, I told you we're going to look at the chart a lot. See the line under Nadab? That means Nadab, that's the end of Jeroboam's family. Baasha is going to become king after Nadab. We'll find out how. But Asa is king over here, and Asa has some relationship, some association, some contact with Baasha. And we're talking about Asa. And in talking about Asa, we have to include his encounter here with Baasha, even though he hadn't got Baasha really on the throne yet, but obviously he gets there. And here's a situation that developed between Asa and Baasha. They, like the others, they warred against one another the whole time. But now here's what happened in verse 17. Baasha, the king of Israel, went up against Judah and built Ramah, that he might not suffer any to go out or to come in to Asa, king of Judah. What does Baasha do? He tries to blockade Judah. He tries to stop people from going to Judah. He doesn't want Asa to have free commerce and free back and forth with people. He builds this fortification, or starts it, called Ramah. Well, of course, Asa didn't like that. And Asa took up silver, verse 18, and gold, and he delivered them to, of all people, Ben-Hadad. Now, who's Ben-Hadad? Ben-Hadad is king of Syria. Keep in mind, folks, Syria and Israel have been enemies all through history. Why would Asa go to the enemies of Israel with a bribe to do something? It's because he needed help and he didn't know how he was going to get it otherwise. He compromised his position there, didn't he? He went to Ben-Hadad and he said, Ben-Hadad, I know you've got a treaty over here with northern Israel. I want you to break that treaty, and I want you to come down here, and I want you to break Baasha's blockade against me, and here's all this good stuff I'm going to give you if you'll do it. He said, okay, I'll do it. And he did. You know, you can't depend upon your allies. They're just liable to turn around and be your enemies before you can think of it. Nations try to build up allies, and the first thing you know, they're going to war with their allies. But here, this is what happened. Ben-Hadad went down there, and he told Baasha and made Baasha stop his blockade. Asa then moved into Ramah, where Baasha was building, and he took all those supplies and all that equipment and everything, and he built him a fortification. And so this was the association that they had with one another. Now, we read in verse 24 that Asa slept with his fathers. He was king for a good long while, but as with all men, he died, and Jehoshaphat becomes king. Jehoshaphat, though he was not as good as Asa, he was considered another good king for southern Judah. So they're going to have at least two in a row that are pretty good kings. That's the reason they were surviving as well as they were. They had good leadership. They had godly men at the helm. And that's always a strength for a nation. Northern Israel, whew, what they had. Jeroboam, Nadab, Baasha. Now at verse 25, put an NI. We're going back over here now and talk about Northern Israel for a while. Nadab, verse 26, did evil in the sight of the Lord. Well, what else is new with that bunch of folks? And look what Baasha does. Baasha, verse 27, conspired against him, and Baasha smote him. And Baasha smote all the house of Jeroboam. In verse 29, as because of the sins of Jeroboam which he sinned, verse 30, which he made Israel to sin by his provocation, wherewith he provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger. So Baasha destroys Nadab and takes over the throne. A different family. You'll notice, as we have already read back over in verse 16 and verse 32, there was war between Asa and Baasha. But what about Baasha? Verse 34 tells us, he did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin. I think we made mention last time briefly about a heritage and a legacy people will leave for their descendants. When they come along here with these kings in northern Israel, so many times, not every time, but so many times when they wanted to say he was real bad, they say he did like Jeroboam. Now, isn't that a nice way to leave people? And I think we mentioned to you, I don't know whether I mentioned to you or not, how would you like it if somebody's going to mention bad, he did like you? That's the way he did. You're just as bad as he was. And he was really an awful thing. That's what Jeroboam did. Contrast that, folks, with over here in southern Judah. When you wanted to commend a king, he said he did like David. What a difference between David and Jeroboam, which ought to sober us into thinking, what kind of legacy will we leave to those who follow us? Will they be compared to something good? I often say, are we going to leave our children something to live up to or something to have to live down? Well, it depends on how we behave ourselves. In chapter 16, we read this man of Jehu. Now, if you look on the king chart and come way on down in the king chart, we're going to read a man about Jehu, but that Jehu over here in northern Israel is a king. This Jehu is a prophet. He's not the same guy. And he's the son of Hanani, and we're going to find out that Hanani is also a prophet. And Jehu comes to Baasha and says, thou hast walked in the way of Jeroboam, hast made my people Israel to sin. What's going to happen to Baasha? I will take away the posterity of Baasha, the posterity of his house. I will make thy house like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Look what is going to happen to Baasha's family. Him that dieth of Baasha in the city shall the dogs eat. Him that dieth in his fields shall the fowls of the air eat. Just like it said of Jeroboam. Yeah, you've overthrown Nadab. You've become king. But you remember what was said about Jeroboam? Same thing's going to happen to you, Brother Baasha. Why? It's because he did so evil himself. Another evil king over the nation. The nation didn't have a chance, hardly did it. One evil man after another. So Baasha slept with his fathers. His son Elah becomes king. But Jehu, during the lifetime of Baasha, came to Baasha. He prophesied against Baasha. Elah becomes king. You'll notice over the king chart there's a line under Elah. There's going to be a change in family again. And who becomes king? A man named Zimri. Zimri was the captain of the chariots of Elah. But Elah got himself drunk, and Zimri went into him, and Zimri killed him and took his throne. But Zimri was a weak king. He lasted 7 days. Weak king, you'll get that on the way home. He was just a 7-day king, and he lost his throne just that quick. But thus did Zimri destroy all the house of Baasha according to the word of the Lord, verse 12, which he spake against Baasha by Jehu the prophet. Now, this is the way in verse 18 that Zimri died. He burned down his palace, and he died in that palace. It sounds like he committed suicide. You know, if I was going to commit suicide, and I hadn't thought about it, but I don't believe I'd want to do it by burning. I'd want to do it some easy way. I don't know how it would be easy to do it, but I sure will want to burn myself up. He must have been nuts. He overthrew the king, reigned for a week, burned himself up. Hallelujah for Zimri. And now who becomes king? Look on your king chart, and you meet a man named Omri. Now, Omri has 4 men that serve as king in his family, doesn't he, according to the chart? Omri doesn't become king real easily. Now, there was contention between northern Israel and southern Judah, but there was a struggle for power in northern Israel between a man named Omri and a man named Tibni. Omri wins out for the good reason. Timni died. He couldn't very compete after that. Omri is the king, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Verse 25, he did worse than all that were before him. He walked in the way of Jeroboam. Verse 26, but when he died, here's the man you heard about. Ahab becomes king. Oh boy, you talk about a rascal and a scoundrel. That is Ahab. And Asa's still king over here in Judah for a little bit, but Ahab becomes king. But I want to mention just one thing before our class closes. Verse 31, look who Ahab marries. Jezebel. You talk about a pair. Ahab and Jezebel. Verse 33 says Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings that were before him. There was something that happened during the time of Ahab. Hold that bell just a second. You know, when Joshua took the city of Jericho, he said, anybody that tries to build this city, the man that starts, his son will die, and when he finishes, his other son will die. Well, there's a guy here named Hiel, in a period of time when there was rebellion against God, to be sure. He evidently didn't care about his sons or didn't believe God's prophecy and warning. He rebuilt the city of Jericho, but when he started, one son died. When he finished, the other son died. Folks, God keeps his word. Now, we can learn that from these people, can't we? These things were written for our learning, not to just tell us what happened. God is faithful to his word. And we were smart if we will pay attention to that. And when we enter into chapter 17, you're going to enter and talk about one of the greatest things in all the Bible. And a drought. And how God took care of him. And if you'll tune in next week, we'll find out about it. That'll do it for tonight.